I'm Tony Northrup, and Sony just announced a new a7R2. This is the update to the original a7R, which was their high megapixel full-frame mirrorless camera. The original a7R had some real problems. It had this great 36 megapixel sensor, but it was really the first camera to introduce a high megapixel sensor like that, and it sometimes shook too much, which would add vibration, and there was just a lot of refinements that are needed, and Sony seems to have added those refinements and a whole lot more. I'm actually excited about this camera. In an era when we see so many tiny incremental updates, like from the D5300 to the D5500, this is a huge update, and this camera is unique and revolutionary in many ways. Up first, the 42.4 megapixel sensor is about like a 17% improvement over the previous generation's 36 megapixel sensor. It's rated up to ISO 102,000, which is basically, we found, meaningless. It doesn't seem like having higher ISOs actually means you get better image quality. This sensor is unique in another way. Besides the higher megapixel count, it's backlit, which means theoretically it can gather more light, therefore providing cleaner images, and it might even provide sharper images. We have a backlit sensor in the Samsung NX1, and I can't say we've really noticed any difference, so we'll have to wait and actually test the new sensor in the Sony a7R II when it's available come August. This is an example provided by Sony promoting one of their backlit sensors, demonstrating how much more light the back illuminated structure can get. So that, to me, it looks like maybe a stop or a stop and a half of light. If it could actually gather that much more light, that should mean significantly cleaner images. Again, optimistic, but we will wait and see. As with the previous generation, this sensor doesn't have the anti-aliasing filter or the optical low-pass filter that plague so many cameras like the 5D Mark III and just about all of the Canon cameras except for the 5DSR. We've worked with both cameras that don't and do have that anti-aliasing filter, and we're all about taking off that aliasing filter. We find it improves sharpness to take it off without ever adding any of the negative effects that they claim, like increased moire. If you take a picture of a test chart, you'll see that extra moire, but in the real world, using cameras like the a7R and the D810 that don't have those filters, we've never had any problem. They're adding Steady Shot inside, which is Sony's version of in-body image stabilization, or IBIS. Basically, it moves the sensor around to counteract camera shake. Now, in many of the Sony lenses, like this lens here attached to my Sony a7 II, have image stabilization in the lens, which means you don't necessarily need it in the body. If it is in the lens, that can be a little bit better. But we love having image stabilization in the body because it means you can attach a fast prime, like that incredibly sharp Sony 55mm f1.8, and get handheld shots with it at slow shutter speeds without any shakiness. Any lens you put on there, including adapted Canon or Nikon DSLR lenses, they're all stabilized. And that means this Sony a7 II has been my favorite just to grab and go camera because I can put a fast lens on there and take night photography pictures at ISO 100 handheld. It really is revolutionary to have the image stabilization on the sensor in a full frame camera. You can just get unbeatable image quality without a tripod. So we absolutely love it. It also works great for video, allowing you to use fast lenses like that Medicon 50mm f0.95, super fast but not stabilized. But with this on the new Sony a7R II, it will be stabilized. Pretty remarkable. I'm excited about that feature. This is a sample provided by Sony, showing you the kind of intense amounts of detail that 40 megapixels can get you. We recently reviewed the 50 megapixel Canon 5DSR against the 36 megapixel D810. So do watch those three videos. One of the takeaways is if you're using good glass, you will see significantly better sharpness. If you're using okay glass, you will still see a noticeable sharpness improvement. You can see here in this particular close-up, as you look at the model's eyes, it's intense detail at headshot range. So without doing comparison, it's hard for me to gauge how much that is, but it looks pretty great to me. Sony's bragging about the improved autofocus system, and this was maybe the single biggest weakness of the a7R, the original. Autofocus just terribly. And you see a similar autofocus system in the a7S, our go-to video camera. It's just appalling. Even using the native Sony lenses, it's incredibly slow. It means there's no hope of really tracking action, and using it for things like portraiture is painful. It's not that you can't get portraiture done, but if you had the choice between a DSLR and an a7R for taking portraits, I promise you fire off a couple of frames and you're going to be going for that DSLR, because the focusing on a DSLR, especially at that price range, is so much snappier. Well, Sony put a lot of work into improving it for the Alpha 7 II. They spread the focusing points out over more of the frame. They included phase detect focusing points, which should improve the focusing when you're using the Sony Alpha SLT lenses, like the adapted lenses from their SLR-like line of cameras. They're kind of implying that it's not going to help you out when you're using the native Sony mirrorless E-mount lenses. That's something that we'll test. We did test the Alpha 7 II, which has a similar focusing system, and we found it to be okay for a mirrorless camera. It didn't keep up with the Samsung NX1, a mirrorless camera that has an amazing focusing system, and it definitely does not keep up with DSLRs at even half the price. So you can see that they have a couple of slides here about the improved responsiveness of the autofocus system, and it shoots at 5 frames a second, which for that number of megapixels is about what we've come to expect from the 5DSR and the D810, which is a little bit faster. They're saying it's going to track focus. Again, Sony tends to overstate the autofocus systems on their cameras. They're a little tricky about that, but we'll put it through a real gamut of tests to see how it performs when it's released in August. They're also saying that this will help for video. Now, if you go back and watch our comparison of the Samsung NX1, the GH4, and the Sony Alpha 7S for 4K video, you'll find that the A7S had terrible, terrible video focus tracking capabilities. Both the GH4 and the NX1 left it in the dust. There is no hope of tracking moving subjects with the Alpha 7S while you're recording video. And the same would have been true of the Alpha 7R. So we're excited to see that maybe this new Alpha 7R will be able to do 4K and track moving subjects. That would be pretty huge for the type of work that we do. They've also updated the optical or the electronic viewfinder, the viewfinder that you can hold up, and it's not like a DSLR where the light is actually bounced on an old-timey mirror up to your eye. No, it's got a little display in there so you can see what's going on, and I love electronic viewfinders. You can see focus peaking, you can zoom in, you can review your pictures without taking the camera away from your eye. If you're under or overexposed, you can see a histogram in the viewfinder. You can see a preview of what the brightness of the actual image. They're fantastic. You can shoot in black and white and see black and white in the viewfinder. You can look around and see a black and white world. Well, Sony claims they're improving the viewfinder with a greater coverage. It should be a bigger, brighter, and sharper screen. They provided this comparison with what they call a conventional viewfinder on the left and the Alpha 7R viewfinder on the right. I have no idea how fair of a comparison that is, but we will test it out really soon. They are also saying that the new camera is going to be processing images much faster. So one of the problems with the Alpha 7R was it was just slow. It was just slow in every way. And it got to be not fun. It got to be a little bit frustrating. So that should go away. They're claiming huge performance improvements. Another thing that will help produce sharper images is the inclusion of an electronic shutter. You can either do an electronic first curtain shutter or a completely silent electronic shutter. We have that on the GH4, and I absolutely love it, especially when I'm traveling, because you can go into a church and take pictures without disturbing anybody. It's completely silent. And as a wedding photographer, I dream of that kind of thing, to be able to take pictures without anybody hearing me. But there hasn't really been a full-frame camera that would allow me to shoot that kind of work with a completely silent shutter. We'll see how the A7R does, but silent and having the electronic shutter also eliminates the vibrations induced by the shutter, which can reduce the sharpness of the overall image. So sharper images and silent operation. This Sony Alpha 7R II is going to cost you $3,200. It's going to be released publicly available sometime in August. You cannot yet pre-order it. You'll be able to pre-order it in about a week. But check it out at sdp.io/A7R2 for B&H, and we'll get a few pennies of every dollar that you spend. Let's take a detailed look at the physical layout of the camera. On the left, we see the original Alpha 7R, and on the right, we see the Alpha 7R II. You'll see it looks like virtually identical to the Alpha 7 II if you're familiar with this camera. One difference that I can find is the mode dial here on the top now has a locking button. That seems unnecessary to us because in our experience with the Alpha 7S and the Alpha 7 II, we've never accidentally changed the mode dial. Other cameras, it's been a problem. Anyway, it's a welcome inclusion. Otherwise, it's identical to that. You see it includes the new kind of rougher finish, which we like. And the button placement is just a little bit different. As before, it includes an articulating, it includes a tilt screen, which tilts up or down, not an articulating screen like the GH4, which is too bad because we love a fully articulating screen. It's fantastic for video. The top view here, again, we see they've moved a few buttons around, but functionally, it's not that much different. And on the right side view, again, no particular differences. Unfortunately, they stuck with the micro HDMI port instead of going with a full HDMI port or even a mini HDMI port. And that's a real problem with the Alpha 7S that we use all the time. That little port can come loose and screw up your video. It also tends to break really easy. We wish they would just include a bigger port. It would just make porting it out over HDMI for recording much easier. So as we examine how much more detail we can get out of this 42 megapixel sensor compared to the previous generation's 36 megapixel sensor, our experience comparing increases in megapixel count with other cameras leads me to believe that those extra 17% pixels will give you about a 5 to 10% increase in actual sharpness. And that's not a huge amount. You will be able to see those differences when you're using sharp lenses and good technique. If you're using less sharp lenses, handheld, you'll see a little bit of difference. You will, but not a huge amount of difference. That's coming from having just recently compared the 50 megapixel Canon 5DSR to the 36 megapixel D810. That difference is bigger, but the differences were pretty distinct. They're going to be less distinct here. The biggest news for me on the Alpha 7R is the 4K internal full frame recording, and that's a big deal. We recently reviewed basically all the mirrorless 4K cameras out there of this style of interchangeable lens camera, and none of them could do full frame internal recording. The GH4 and the NX1 can record internally, but the GH4 has a 2.3x crop, the NX1 has a 1.5x crop. The Alpha 7R will record internally with a 1x crop, no crop. The Alpha 7S can record 4K, but you need an external recorder. So instead of shooting like this when we're looking to be discreet, Justin, our cameraman, can just kind of grab this and shoot it in a park or something handheld. With the A7S, he's got to grab this huge, heavy rig and put it on his shoulder, mostly because you need that external recorder, that Shogun. The Shogun also runs you an extra about $2,000, $1,800 to $2,000, and you have to buy hard drives for it. And anyway, it's bulky, it's expensive, and the external screen has its own benefits, but being able to just carry a little lens like this when you're in a public place is really priceless. So that 4K internal recording will mean a lot to us, especially when we can get full frame image quality and background blur. It also offers S-Log, which is Sony's proprietary method for cramming more dynamic range into a non-RAW file. Basically, it means you have to grade it in post to increase that contrast again. But you can get super bright skies that aren't blown out and still retain shadow detail. It's something that we really love about the Alpha 7S. There are two 4K recording modes. You can record full frame, which is great. Or you can go into a Super 35 mode, which seems to have about a 1.5x crop factor, and you'll get better image quality with more crop. So you won't get the same background blur. You'll get a slightly different field of view. Your 50 millimeter lens will begin to behave like a 75 millimeter lens. But Sony explains that the Super 35 crop does away with pixel binning. So even though they have about 80% more pixels than the standard 4K 8 megapixel size, they're able to process multiple pixels together, which should reduce moire artifacts and improve noise. So how is this going to compare to the A7S? I'm not sure. we'll have to test it. The full frame readout does use pixel binning. And as we look at this sample image here, we can see the A7S not using pixel binning versus two cameras that are using pixel binning. So the difference can be pretty extreme. Pixel binning greatly increases the noise. So I think the full frame readout on the a7R II is not going to be as clean as that of the a7S. But I hope that that super 35mm format will be almost as clean. Now, it's gathering less than half the light of the Sony a7S with its full frame sensor because it does have that 1.5x crop. You have to square that crop. 1.5 times 1.5 is 2.25. So it's slightly less than half of the total light. So we should see a loss of about one stop of ISO performance. But nonetheless, the ability to record internally should help out a lot and give filmmakers like ourselves another option. They're using the XAVC-S codec at 100 megabits per second, which is good. It should be fine. We haven't noticed any improvement when going at higher codecs than that, so I'll be happy with it. Let's take a quick look at a 4K clip that Sony provided. It goes through several different ISOs, and I have to say, it looks absolutely beautiful and super sharp, but I'm not pleased with the high ISO samples. They look great. I don't see any noise, but I'm not pleased because they wildly underexpose them. They use these kind of night shots with just little bits of highlights in there from the lights in the houses, and I don't know if I don't know how to assess the amount of noise in it. If it were properly exposed in a daylit scene, it'd be much easier for me to tell how it compares to the a7S. So we'll just wait and do the test ourselves. We are really excited about this camera. We have a few disappointments, but they're actually way fewer than for just about any recent camera that's been announced. Usually I go through and I say, oh, it doesn't have 4K recording. It has internal 4K recording in a couple of different formats. Just about everything that we want. No touchscreen though. And for a camera that could be an amazing video camera, the lack of a touchscreen is a real problem. The touchscreen allows you to easily focus on a subject while recording. Without a touchscreen, you can use the little directional pad to move your focusing point around and push a button to focus, but that's going to jiggle the camera. And that's not acceptable while you're recording. So your alternative is to get kind of a big focus pulling rig and often a separate focus puller. A touchscreen would allow us to take better advantage of that new focusing system while recording. Touchscreens are also useful for reviewing your pictures and quickly zooming in to, say, pan around an entire group photo, making sure everybody's face is nice and sharp. You get the job done in about a quarter of the time over having to use a directional pad and little magnification buttons. The screen is also a tilting screen that flips out like this, rather than an articulating screen like on the GH4. And so for people who might be filming themselves, the articulating screen allows you to flip it forward so you can see yourself a little more easily, but it also moves it out to the side, and it's just generally more functional, especially for filmmaking, than a tilt screen, but the tilt screen is acceptable. Finally, as I mentioned before, it has a micro HDMI port, which is just kind of a pain. The little cable slips out and it tends to break and wear out. Full-size HDMI ports are much more reliable, and it has a USB 2 port, which isn't a huge deal. I'm glad you can actually charge or power the camera with a USB, which means you could hook up a USB charger and record for longer periods of time without running out of the battery. You can also charge it in your car if you want to while you're out traveling. But a USB 3 port would have been more ideal because we often end up pulling these large files off of the camera over USB, and it will just happen faster. Also, we've been tethering a lot with the D810 and the 5DSR, and they both have USB 3. And you really need it with these big, huge, like 50 megabyte RAW files. So I can't imagine tethering with the a7R II over that lousy USB 2 port. It's just going to be too slow. And that means for things like portraiture and commercial work that might be faster paced, it could end up being frustrating. But that's something that we'll test when it's actually available. So thanks for joining me. If you want to see more free videos, click subscribe. We have new videos out every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Share it with your friends. And if you want more from us, check out our books, Stunning Digital Photography, our photography buying guide, which teaches you all about gear like lenses and flashes and tripods and studio lights, And if you're into post-processing, learning how to edit and organize your pictures, check out my Lightroom 5 and Lightroom 6 books. Thanks so much.